name's Tamara Habberley and I'm from a firm called the VAT People, and I work alongside Jerome providing VAT advice for Jerome's clients. The topic I'm discussing today is VAT and the long awaited and much delayed reverse charge, and this is a reverse charge for building services. So you may think, why on earth introduce a reverse charge? Well, the main reason it's been introduced is because Hmrc have a perception that there's widespread VAT fraud throughout the UK. They believe, for various reasons, that one of the main areas where fraud is prevalent with VAT is the construction sector. And if you think about that, there is a kind of reason, logic behind that, because with construction services, often you'll have high amounts of VAT being generated in terms of supplies where somebody may be recovering high amounts of VAT, but they won't actually declare any output VAT for maybe a couple of years until a property is constructed and then sold. So that obviously, if you were a fraudulent VAT trader, that would be a sector you'd be interested in, because you could potentially claim a lot of VAT and not actually declare any output VAT and then just disappear. So the idea of the reverse charge is to stop those kind of frauds. There's already similar domestic reverse charge mechanisms in the UK. One was for gold traders that was introduced, it must be at least 20 years ago. There's also a similar reverse charge for computer chips and mobile phone dealers in certain circumstances. Now, obviously, because it's an anti-fraud mechanism, it may be possible to kind of circumvent the reverse charge by putting structures in place. The thing there, though, is I would say, because it's an anti-fraud measure, Hmrc are likely to take a dim view of any planning that's intended to get a business outside of the reverse charge. So that's something that you'd always want to look at very, very carefully. And also, as it's an anti-fraud measure and it's compulsory, if a business hasn't implemented it, but when it's introduced on the 1st of March 2021, it's likely that Hmrc are going to be quite unsympathetic. They did say when they were previously due to introduce a reverse charge, which was delayed in the light of the pandemic, that they would apply a 6-month light touch. But given that this has been delayed and delayed, I suspect that light touch may be a little bit heavier when it's finally implemented. So when does it apply from, and what does it apply to? It will apply to any invoices where the tax point for the invoice is on or after the 1st of March 2021. Now, that may sound a long time away, but it's not really. You've got, 3 or 4 months. If you take Christmas into account, you've probably got 4 months or less, really, to get planning to make sure your systems can account for the reverse charge and you understand correctly when it applies. And you would also need to start thinking now, if you're contracting for new work, as to how the reverse charge will impact on that. The reverse charge, it will affect any ongoing contracts that span pre and post 1st of March 2021. And it's a legal requirement. You can't just choose to be within or outside the reverse charge. Your suppliers are either liable to it or they're not. It's as simple as that. So where does the reverse charge apply to? It applies to supplies of building and construction services, but only ones that are supplied at a positive VAT rate. So if you're a builder and the construction services you're supplying are zero rated for VAT, for example, if you're involved in constructing a new dwelling, you won't be caught by the reverse charge because there's no VAT. So Hmrc will not be interested in those transactions. Where it will catch you is any standard rated VAT work. So any building services on existing dwellings or on commercial properties, for example, they'll be caught. And any work that's to do with the change in the number of dwellings in a building that gets a reduced rate of VAT, for example, that will be caught. And it applies to supplies where they need to be reported under the CIS scheme. Now, I'll be quite honest here, if you ask me anything about CIS tax, I'd say I'm really sorry. Can't help you, I just know of its existence. CIS in itself is a separate discipline where you need separate advice. These services are term specified services by Hmrc. They're specified and then they fall into the reverse charge. Now, unlike CIS tax, like I say, I don't really have any in-depth knowledge of CIS tax, but I do know that CIS tax supplies are reported in a different way to how reverse charge VAT supplies will be reported. Because for VAT, the reverse charge won't just apply to the building services that you're supplying. It will also apply to the building materials that you're supplying under the same contract for those building services. Because for VAT purposes, we just simply treat the whole lot as a supply building services. So the whole lot that's supplied by a single supplier will fall into the reverse charge. If, however, you're a building merchant and you're simply providing the building materials and not providing building services, you won't be caught by the reverse charge. So, and there are other instances where the reverse charge doesn't apply. And this is going to be one of the areas that makes the reverse charge complex to account for, because it doesn't apply to builders who supply direct to the end user. And Hmrc use this term end user, and it is worth becoming familiar with what it actually means, because it's not quite as simple as it sounds. So the end user will be the end consumer of the services. So if you're providing building services to a member of the public, they're an end user. If you're providing building services to the property owner, they're also an end user. And if you're supplying, and where it gets more complex, if you're supplying your building services to somebody who uses those building services to make a different type of supply, they're an end user. So you might think, well, what on earth does that mean? What that basically means is, if you're providing building services to somebody who's going to let the property out, or is constructing a property specifically to sell it, and it's their property that they're selling or their property that they're going to let out, they're using your services for a different type of supply. So that supply won't fall into the reverse charge. You'll be charging them VAT and being paid VAT as normal, providing it's obviously not something that's zero rated for that. And that means you need to be thinking really at the start of contracts, and also if you're midway through a contract that's caught by the reverse charge, because it's still ongoing after the 1st of March 2021, are you supplying to an end user, or are you supplying to somebody who's not an end user? To add a further layer of complexity, the reverse charge also doesn't apply if you're supplying somebody who's what Hmrc term an intermediary. And this is where it will start to get more difficult, because an intermediary is a customer who is connected party and connected in the direct tax sense. So they might be jointly controlled by the same individual by way of shares, or they've got some form of connection. So if your customer is a connected party, so they say a builder who's connected to the person who owns the land that's being built on and constructed on or worked on, that falls outside the reverse charge. So that is yet another layer of complexity. And customers who are not UK VAT registered, reverse charge doesn't apply to them. Something I've been asked about a few times is, does it apply to labour and employment bureaus who supply staff? Well, no, it doesn't. If you're buying in staff from a labour or an employment bureau, they shouldn't be reverse charging their services to you. They should just be charging VAT as normal, which you can then recover. So how the reverse charge works, it is a relatively simple mechanism, because what happens is once you've worked out the complex bit, does it apply or doesn't it apply? Because that's really the important bit, is if you're supplying what Hmrc term as specified services, i.e. reverse charge services, you'll still issue a VAT invoice, or if you're contracting with a builder, they should still issue a VAT invoice to you, and it will show the correct VAT rate applicable to the work, but it will not show the total amount, including VAT, as being payable. So if you're supplying your customers with building services, you'll be drafting an invoice or sending out an invoice that will show all the normal information on a VAT invoice. So, your name, your address, your VAT number, your customer's name, customer's address. It'll show the net amount, a description of your building services. It'll show the VAT rate, but you won't charge VAT on that invoice. And your customer will not pay the VAT to you. They'll just be paying you the net amount. If you're the recipient of the service, you'll be getting an invoice. It just shows a net amount that you then pay. You don't pay your supplier the VAT if it's reverse chargeable. So what you do then, if you're the recipient of a reverse charge service, you simply declare the output VAT, almost as though you've made the supply yourself. And if you're using those building services to make VATable supplies to your customer, then you get full VAT recovery. So it's just purely an in and an out transaction if you're the recipient of the reverse charge service. And that is the whole purpose of the reverse charge. Is now the recipient is both declaring output VAT and recovering input VAT, instead of it simply recovering, paying a supplier and recovering input VAT, because that blocks VAT frauds that revolve around claiming input VAT when they might not have necessarily ever have paid the supplier and then just disappearing. That fraud will no longer work, which I'm sure everybody's like me thinks good, because you shouldn't have businesses involved in VAT frauds, but it blocks you straight away because you're declaring the output VAT and recovering it. As a recipient of the supply, you're accounting for that on the reverse charge. As the supplier, all that will be shown on your VAT return now is the net value of the service you've supplied. You won't be putting any VAT for reverse charge service on your supplies. Where it will become quite complex for some builders is if they're making a mixture of supplies to people who are end users or intermediaries, not within the reverse charge, and where they're accounting for VAT on a VAT invoice and declaring and paying it to Hmrc. That same builder may also be making supplies that are within the reverse charge to other customers. So you'll end up in a situation where you've got a high level of net outputs and possibly VAT on your VAT return, which if you compare the VAT on your VAT return to your net outputs on your same VAT return will be less than 20%. So obviously you need to reconcile and make sure that you can explain why that is. And the reason will be it's because some of the services are reverse chargeable. Totally different concept for accounting for VAT. Now this unfortunately creates a massive new compliance burden on businesses who are supplying building services or receiving building services effectively. And this is very much kind of the ethos now for VAT. Hmrc are pushing the compliance burden down onto you as a builder or as a VAT registered business. What it means is if you're supplying services that are within the reverse charge, you will need to be checking, is your customer VAT registered? And is your customer's VAT number valid? Because the customer's liable to account for the reverse charge. If they don't account for it, because it turns out they're not actually VAT registered or they've given you a bogus VAT number, then there's going to be VAT seepage. And customers who are accounting for the reverse charge will need to carry out the same checks on their suppliers, because the customer will be accounting for the VAT on the reverse charge. What I would recommend with customers, any new customers, and Hmrc saying their guidance on the reverse charge, you will need to do this as a business. You will need to obtain proof and verify the CIS VAT registered and also VAT registered. Hmrc recommend ideally use their CIS verification system to verify if the customer is CIS registered. For VAT numbers, what I would recommend now is, because almost all businesses now supply their returns digitally, because of MTD, they'll have a government gateway account. On their government gateway account, on the VAT section of the government gateway account, you can actually print off a copy of your certificate of registration, and they'll give you a copy saying when you registered from, and it'll also give you the date that was printed off. And you'd need to keep that as evidence. And I would suggest checking on a regular basis that your customer is still VAT registered or your supplier is still VAT registered. And by regular basis, it's kind of down to common sense. If you're dealing with somebody on a regular basis, I'd say check maybe once a year or 6 months. If you're dealing with them on a one-off basis, you just make that check the once. It does say that you don't need to verify the CIS registration for existing customers if your contract's already within CIS. All you need is to retain proof of the deduction, CIS deductions as part of your VAT records. So you're now doing 2 separate checks that are looking at effectively 2 separate tax regimes. You're kind of doing all the credibility checks that Hmrc would do if they came out and did a VAT inspection. So it's pushing the onus onto businesses really to police these supplies. And it does mean your invoice system and your formats of your invoices will need to change. And you'll need to make sure your accounting system can cope with that. If somebody using Sage, for example, I would expect that Sage, who's very switched on from a VAT accounting viewpoint, that Sage would already have some kind of patch or update in place to allow you to account for this reverse charge. It's more of an issue if you're using, say, a bespoke accounting system or an older software system, and you'll need to check, can your software system cope with this? Will you need to set up a new VAT code so that you're making sure that those invoices are treated where you're issuing an invoice that's reverse chargeable, but it's kind of treated like a zero-rated supply. You're not triggering VAT and not accidentally accounting for VAT on your VAT return to Hmrc. So that is something, and I would suggest if you haven't done so already, check that's in place now, because it will take some time in the case of some software systems to actually update them. There are also new invoice requirements, and this again is another change really in how you deal with your VAT, because the new invoicing requirements mean that if you're a subcontractor who is issuing invoices to a main contractor, then you'll still need to issue a VAT invoice, but the format changes, as I mentioned earlier. You actually have to now state on the invoice that the supply is subject to domestic reverse charge and that the customer should account for VAT on the reverse charge. And if you're receiving reverse chargeable invoices, it should have that statement on it. And it should clearly show the VAT rate applicable under the reverse charge or the amount of VAT that's due under the reverse charge. But the VAT shouldn't be included in the amount that's charged to the customer. So what that means is, as I said earlier, you'll have a net amount on your invoice, and you'll either have the VAT rate or the VAT, and then you'll have the amount that the customer is due to pay you, and that'll be the net amount. I would suggest it's more sensible just to have the net amount and the VAT rate, because that saves confusion, but that really depends on how your software can deal with changing your invoices. If your software can't produce the invoices showing the amount of VAT to be accounted for or the VAT rate, what you would need to do is have wording on the invoice that explains what the applicable VAT rate is based on the VAT exclusive selling price of reverse charge services. And I'm saying reverse charge services, obviously I mean there, it's building services and also building services and building materials provided under a single contract for building services. In other words, you don't have to split the two out and have two separate invoices. This will also change procedures like authenticated tax receipts and self-billing, which obviously in the building sector is, these are quite prevalent, because authenticated tax receipts, self-billing invoices, they give the customer an ability to have control over the supplier, over how much they're paying, when they pay, etc. If you're using self-billing invoicing or authenticated receipts, what you need to do is you'll need to show the supplier's name, address, and VAT registration number as usual, and the usual VAT invoice details. For self-billed invoices, you'll have to, as usual, clearly mark it as a self-billed invoice and show the amount of VAT or the rate of VAT due under the reverse charge. But you'll also have to have additional information on your self-billed invoice. And that's there to ensure that your subcontractor doesn't inadvertently account for output VAT on a supply that falls into reverse charge, where you're liable as the customer to account for the supply. So your reverse charge invoice would need to say, we will account for and pay for the output VAT due to Hmrc, or you could say reverse charge as a UK customer, we will pay the VAT due to Hmrc. That's if you're a supplier. Now, the other side of that is the recipient of a self-billed invoice, because obviously as a recipient, you're probably used to getting loads of self-billed invoices or authenticated receipts and getting a gross payment. Now, that will stop if the service is within the reverse charge that you've supplied, because your customer, because they're using self-billing, the customer will be accounting for VAT on the reverse charge, and you, as the supplier, won't be paid for the VAT by your customer and won't be declaring it to Hmrc. So that will change your cash flow quite radically. It'll also change what you're putting on your VAT return. So that comes to the problems that self-billing will create, in my view, for a number of businesses. The biggest one, I think, will be cash flow, certainly for smaller or even big businesses for that matter. If you're a subcontractor, and particularly ones that are on, say, self-billing, and so the main contractor self-bills them, you're probably used to using the VAT that you get in to support your cash flow, because unless you're on monthly VAT returns, most businesses providing building services get a cash flow benefit from the VAT. So say my example, invoicing in January, say January 2022, because that's the reverse charge is in and running by then. you've got a calendar quarter VAT return. So your VAT return period ends March, but you won't be paying the VAT to Hmrc until April of the same year. What would happen is, normally you'd be invoicing 30-day payment terms. So you'd issue the invoice, you'd receive payment in February on your self-billed invoice, and you'd be sitting there and waiting to pay that VAT until April. Unfortunately, I've noticed it says 2019. That's obviously wrong now. In this example, it'd be 2022. So you'd be waiting until April to pay the VAT to Hmrc, and you'd have the benefit of that VAT, that cash flow benefit, for 2 months. So you'd probably be using that VAT to support your business, to buy more building materials, etc. And then you get to April and you pay your VAT return. Now, once the reverse charge comes in, that cash flow advantage totally disappears, because instead of paying the VAT, being paid the VAT and being able to hold it and use it until you come to submit your VAT return, you're just not being paid VAT. You're getting a net amount. So that can be a real issue if you're a subcontractor who you rely on that VAT as part of your cash flow forecast. So if you haven't done so already, you really need to look at how this will impact on you and how it will impact in practice on your cash flow. Because it's not just a paperwork exercise, this. And although I'm interested in VAT for the technicalities, the real life issue is how it's going to affect your cash flow. The other side, though, obviously, is if you're the supplier, if you're the customer, you're no longer having to pay that VAT out. You're just paying a net amount out. So, there are some beneficiaries in this. But I can see that this can be a real problem. Now, what Hmrc have suggested to try and mitigate this impact is for subcontractors who will be the person who is making the reverse charge supply and no longer being paid the VAT, to move on to monthly VAT returns. And the idea being there that you can claim your VAT back on building materials and other costs that don't fall into reverse charge more quickly. That's fine if you're somebody who has got the accounting resources to be able to move on to monthly returns. But if you're a small, one-man band builder, or even a building company with 3 or 4 employees, you may not be in a position to actually account for VAT on a monthly basis. And it creates a lot of other issues. If you're on monthly VAT returns, you've still got to get them in by the due date for submission. You've still got to pay them on time. You've got to make sure they're correct, etc., etc. So although Hmrc are giving good advice in that, go on to monthly VAT returns, you get your VAT back more quickly, it doesn't take into account that might not be practical in the real world for a lot of businesses. Hmrc's other suggestion is also use invoice accounting. The reason for that is that if you've been relying on the cash flow advantage of recovering VAT, of being paid VAT before you pay it to Hmrc, being paid by your customers, if you're on invoice accounting rather than cash accounting, you're able to recover the VAT on all the invoices for your materials straight away before you get paid, before you pay for them. And now, because if you're making reverse charge services, you're not having to declare output VAT on your supply. Cash accounting is no longer advantageous. You need to think about that quite carefully if you're going to move from invoice accounting to cash accounting to invoice accounting, because there are specific rules about how you bring VAT on invoices that you've not previously accounted for to book if you move on to cash accounting. So you want to make sure that you deal with that process correctly, so you don't end up with an assessment for VAT because you've ended up not accounting for VAT at all, because you've moved on to invoice accounting, you forgot about the old invoices where the VAT hasn't been declared on cash accounting, and you also don't want to accidentally double count VAT you've declared previously either. The other big problem, I think, for a lot of builders is going to be identifying the name of the customer, because this is linked to the CIS scheme. So if your customer's within CIS, then in theory the reverse charge applies. However, if they're an end user or an intermediary, the reverse charge will not apply, even though your customer may still be CIS registered. So it's not quite as easy as just saying to customers, have you got CIS registration? Here you are, it's reverse chargeable. Because you need to have a think about, are they an end user or an intermediary or not? I think the intermediary one's going to be the biggest issue. Yeah, end user, I think it should be quite obvious. If the end user is a homeowner, for example, owns an existing house, so where it's standard rated, it's not part of a new build. I think it'd be pretty obvious if you're contracting to make a supply to, and probably the same if you're making a supply of building services where you're constructing a commercial property, for example, and you're working for that property owner. It's the intermediaries that I think are going to catch people out potentially. If your customer, for example, is a construction company and they're a subsidiary, say, of a retail chain, because the retail chain's huge, I don't know, the likes of Asda or Tesco's or whoever, they may have their own captive building company because that might allow them to manage the costs better within a corporate group environment. So their subsidiary may be buying construction services to build a retail unit or a retail property or a warehouse for the group. That may then be let out to another group member. So you've got this chain of supplies going on above your supply building services. In those circumstances, if you're making the supply to the wholly owned subsidiary, the construction company, then that falls outside of the reverse charge. So even though your customer's acting as a main contractor, it's not reverse chargeable by you. And you need to be charging them VAT and they need to be paying you VAT. If you assume it's reverse chargeable and that they're going to account for VAT on a reverse charge, and in fact it's standard rated for VAT, and you're the person who should have accounted for the VAT, Hmrc will come out and they will assess you. They won't assess your customer. So it's really important that you understand where you sit in the supply chain. Are you supplying another builder who's not a connected party, or are they a connected party? Are they an intermediary? Are they the property owner? You need to be aware of that for contracts that span the introduction of the reverse charge on the 1st of March 2021. But I would advise really now, if you're starting to tender for work or you're entering into contracts, you should be thinking about, will this fall into the reverse charge? If it falls into the reverse charge, is my customer an end user or an intermediary? And the contract should envisage those points and make sure it clearly states who's liable to account for the VAT. Is it reverse chargeable, in which case the customer is, or are you going to be raising VAT invoices? It should also have a clause in it to allow that if it turns out you've issued VAT invoices and that was incorrect, or you've received VAT invoices and that's incorrect, that they can be reversed out. And it should also have a clause that if you've treated something as reverse chargeable and it turns out it should have been you issuing invoices and charging VAT, that the contract allows you then to issue a VAT invoice and, most importantly, be paid the VAT by your customer. And if you've assumed it was reverse chargeable and it's not, and that's because the customer has misled you, it should have a clause that you're allowed to pass on any penalties and interest to your customer. And that should be being envisaged at contract stage. Because once you've gone past contract stage and it's not clear who's responsible, if something does go awry and Hmrc come out and assess you, it'll be really difficult to correct your position later. The other issue I envisage is the nature of your customer changing overnight. Because the obvious thing is your customer might start life as an end consumer and contract for building services. And there's no reverse charge there. You're just raising invoices plus VAT, and the customers claim that VAT back. They might then sell the property to a third party under contract terms for completion of the build of the property. And the same customer will continue to receive the building supplies that they contract with from the builder. But what happens there is, because the customer has sold the property and they're now becoming effectively a main contractor, suddenly the reverse charge applies. You'll no longer be paid VAT because you're no longer in a position to raise VAT invoices. So that can affect your cash flow. And obviously, the scope for chaos on who's invoicing, who's accounting for the reverse charge, etc. The scope for that's quite wide. So what you need to do is, again, in contracts, you or whoever draws up the contract for your solicitor should be envisaging what happens in this sort of scenario. and making sure you've got clauses that cover you, warranties in the contract that allow you then to correctly account for the reverse charge or correctly account for VAT, for example. The customer is expected to notify the contractor that the reverse charge applies from the point at which he ceased to be an end consumer. Now, if you're that customer, you know, the onus will be on you to notify your suppliers. But again, that's something that needs to be envisaged and included in warranties for the contract. And if this happens, if your customer's nature has suddenly magically changed, then what you can do is you don't have to issue invoices that have been issued in that period. You can wait till the next accounting period to start accounting for that or applying the reverse charge as applicable. So you might say, goodness me, that's a hell of a lot to take on board. Who benefits from the reverse charge? Well, the main one is obviously Hmrc. He's been brought in, as I said earlier at the start of this, he's been brought in as an anti-fraud mechanism. You're saving Hmrc a lot of money. It ultimately saving the exchequer. And if Hmrc are correct on the view of VAT fraud being rife in the sector, ultimately you're benefiting any taxpayers in the UK and people resident in the UK, because obviously then less VAT seepage. So there's more money coming into the extra. But the biggest beneficiary is really Hmrc in terms of their compliance checks, because you are going to be doing a lot of their compliance work for them. The other beneficiary is contractors. Contractors who would have previously had to pay a gross amount to a building subcontractor, because suddenly instead of paying the gross amount, including VAT, they're just simply paying the net amount. So businesses will now have no VAT payments to contractors to fund until it's recovered from Hmrc. Instead, the business accounts for it on their own VAT return. So if you're a main contractor and your supplies are VATable to your onward customer, but your subcontractors supplying you are all within the reverse charge, you're kind of quids in, because you're going to be declaring VAT and being paid for the VAT by your customer. You don't have to pay VAT to your subcontractors and wait 3-4 months to be able to recover the VAT. There are some winners in this, but I think the biggest issue is the cost really to businesses. In summary, and we've gone through this relatively quickly to allow you to ask questions at the end, is that it really pays to be prepared. You need to make sure you really know at contract stage, or for existing contracts that are spanning the period where the reverse charge is introduced, who your customer actually is. Are they somebody who's going to use your services other than for making an onward supply building services? So that'd be landowners, or somebody who's letting a building out, or potentially also property management businesses. Then that service, that supply is not going to be within the reverse charge. It's going to be plus VAT that you invoice to your customer and that they pay to you. Or is your customer another subcontractor or the main contractor who's not a relevant intermediary or end user? Because if that's the case, if they fall within the reverse charge, the invoices that you'll be raising will be showing the net, the VAT amount, but you'll only be charging your customer and being paid the net amount. So you need to make sure that you understand the cash flow impact of that. And with main contractors, I keep emphasising, you need to make sure that they're not an intermediary. The other thing is you need to make sure any contracts you're entering into now, and also I'd say tenders, envisage who's going to account for the VAT. Is it within the reverse charge or not? Because if you haven't included it in the contract and you haven't got warranties to clearly state, one, who accounts for the VAT, so one, is it a reverse charge service or not? And two, if it transpires that you've accounted for VAT because you thought it wasn't within the reverse charge, or you've accounted for reverse charge because you thought it was, and that either is incorrect because you've been misled in some way by your customer, or the customer's nature changes, like I explained earlier, you need to have warranties in there that allow you to correct the invoices that have been issued. And if it means that your supply becomes subject to VAT, that you can pass on the VAT charge to your customer and be paid it. And if the reason why you've accounted for VAT on a reverse charge and that was incorrect is due to the customer misleading you or not telling you when they should that their nature has changed, need to have warranties in there so that you can pass on penalties and interest to your customer so that you don't suffer the cost. If you haven't got any warranties envisaging all of that, then you've got a real problem. Because if Hmrc come out and you were the person who was supposed to have charged VAT and you haven't, they will intervene between you and the customer. They'll say that part of it's a commercial dispute. They'll assess you for VAT, penalties and interest. And the issue there is, obviously, if your customer no longer exists, say, for example, I don't know, you've done building services for somebody who's an SPV, for example, who's been set up specifically to deal with that one property construction. And then once the construction's finished, that business has been wound up. Hmrc can assess back 4 years. You may find that you can't pass the VAT cost on then to your customer. So this is why I keep emphasising you need to ideally get it right, make sure the contract sets out who's accounting for what at the start of the contract, and make sure that you've got evidence to support your position. The other thing that is a concern to me is people's accounting systems. They need to be geared up to account for VAT on the reverse charge, because you need to make sure that if your services are reverse chargeable, your system isn't merely still declaring VAT on the supply to Hmrc. And likewise, if it's a supply that is actually subject to VAT, that your system hasn't treated as reverse chargeable and not accounted for VAT. And the other big issue to me is the cash flow. You know, the real practicalities are, how are you going to deal with this from a cash flow viewpoint? Have you thought now about what will happen to contracts that span the introduction of the reverse charge, where you may have been dependent on the VAT being received by you to support your cash flow? Because from 1st of March onwards, you won't be getting that VAT if it's reverse chargeable. And also, if you're entering into contracts and tenders now, and I say particularly tenders, if you're sitting there working out how much is it going to cost me to provide these services to my customer, how will I fund that? How much, what level of debt do I need to actually support my business to be able to make these supplies? You've got to take into account that the VAT you might have used and added into your cash flow calculations previously, you're just not going to be receiving it. And similarly, if you're going to be the recipient of the supplies where you're accounting for a reverse charge, you don't now, if it's a reverse chargeable supply, have to include enough funding to cover the VAT you're going to pay for your supplies, because you won't be paying it anymore. So that changes a lot of calculations. So in summary, you really, really need to be prepared for this big change. You've also got a sample, and this is Hmrc's suggested example of a reverse charge invoice, which has recently come up on their website. To be fair to Hmrc, they've actually published some quite decent guidance recently on the reverse charge, and this sets out how they envisage. Obviously, this is the perfect invoice as far as Hmrc are concerned. How they'd envisage the reverse charge services being accounted for on a VAT invoice from a contractor. So you can see there they're showing multiple VAT rates. You've got reduced rate and standard rated work that's being carried out for a customer. And it's just showing the net, the VAT rate, a statement saying reverse charge applies, and the gross amount. And the gross amount is equivalent to net amount, because that's the amount that your customer will be paying you if you're issuing this invoice. And if you're the recipient, that will be the amount that you're paying your customer. Adam's asked a question, and it's a really good one, which is about Hmrc's sample guidance on questions to ask to customers to ascertain their status. They do have a couple of quite good flow charts on Hmrc's website. I say Hmrc's website, it's actually the gov.org website. The search engine on it is dreadful. The best thing I recommend is to actually go into Google or whoever you use as your browser provider, and actually just type in Hmrc VAT building services reverse charge, and you'll pull up the guidance pages, and on there they've got flow charts that actually talk you through the things that you ought to be thinking about to decide whether a customer accounts for VAT on a reverse charge or you charge VAT. And you can actually use that flow chart as the basis for a simple questionnaire for your staff. And to be fair to Hmrc, that's been quite a good thing to have done. Alexander's asked, if the customer does not declare their end user status, what is the default? Well, if they don't declare that they've got an end user status, you'd be treating the supply as a reverse chargeable supply. So you'd be not accounting for VAT on the invoice. And the problem there is that that's just wrong. The default is Hmrc would assess the supplier for VAT. They wouldn't assess the end user. And this is one of the issues, is if they're not declaring that they're an end user, the default, unfortunately, is it's reverse chargeable. So this is why I was saying in your contracts and your warranties in the contracts, you need to make sure that it says that if your customer, it says that they're a main contractor and not an end user, not a relevant intermediary. If that turns out to be incorrect, you are then entitled to pass on the VAT plus penalties and interest to that customer. It's a bit of a thorny area, really, because if the customer has misled you and provided a false statement, I guess there is always a risk to the customer that Hmrc could take action against them, because obviously, to me, if they're not declaring their end status, it indicates that either they don't understand or for some reason they want to have reverse charges when that's not appropriate. But the main thing is you need to cover yourself. If you're the supplier, you need to cover yourself by your warranties. Catherine's asked a question as well, which is, my client refits offices from other companies who then occupy that office but don't necessarily own it. Who is the end user and does reverse charge apply? I'm assuming the subcontractors during the refit will come into the scope of the reverse charge. Yeah, I'd say this, the subcontractors supplying your client, yeah, definitely reverse chargeable. Because if your client's not end user or he's not an intermediary, so he's not connected to these other companies who are going to occupy the office, so he's providing building services, the subcontractors will reverse charge. For your client who's doing the refits for the other companies that are going to occupy the offices, to me, he sounds more like he's the main contractor. So I would think he would be charging VAT because the recipient of his services is using it for different purposes. They're not using it to supply more building services. They're using it so they can occupy that property. Katie's mentioned that they work for building contractors as a subcontractor. If that's and she's also said subcontract, and as a subcontractor, so who would be the end user? Well, if you're working for a building contractor and you're the subby, what would happen there is, in principle, as subcontractor, you wouldn't be charging, you'd show the VAT rate or the VAT amount on your invoice and the statement saying it's reverse chargeable, and you'd be paid the net amount. But the big caveat is you would need to ask your building contractors each time you contract with a new builder, or even each time you work on a new building for that contractor, are they an end user? Just in case you're actually building their offices, because you never know, do you? So are they an end user, or are they a relevant intermediary? Are they a connected party with the person who owns that property or is going to let it out? And when I'm saying you need to ask them, you need to be envisaging that at contract stage. Amy's also said, can you give some real life examples for reference? Oh, I've got a client who fits. They do all sorts of building services now, but their main sort of building services are putting in suspended ceilings and cladding and that type of thing on buildings. Now, in some of their contracts, they're contracting with the main contractor. So, for example, if my client, and I'll just refer to them as my client for anonymity, if my client goes out and they're making a supply and installing cladding in a commercial property for a main contractor, what they'll be doing is saying in the contract stage, saying to that main contractor, confirm you're not the end user or an intermediary. The main contractor confirms that they're not. That my client will be raising a reverse charge invoice because my client is simply providing reverse chargeable services to a main contractor. However, the same client sometimes goes out and puts cladding in accommodation blocks in properties that are being converted for students to live in. And what happens there is, I do know for a fact that one of their customers is actually owned by the business that then rents out the student accommodation to the students. Now, in that scenario, that customer is an intermediary. So my client would have to charge VAT because they're not making a reverse chargeable supply in that scenario. And that is quite complex. If you think about it, if you're contracting with lots of different businesses, it's a lot to ask. And I would say that is a case where have a look on the gov.org website at these flowcharts that customs have published, because they are actually quite useful. I'm always reluctant to say to somebody, look at something Hmrc have generated rather than something I've done. But the flowchart is actually quite simple to follow, and it gives you quite good examples of when it does and when it doesn't apply.
I think that wraps everything up for us today. Thank you very much, Tamara, for that presentation. That was really useful. If anybody does have any further queries, of course, as we said earlier, please get in touch with them. Oh, we have just had one more question come through. I'll just pause for a moment.
On that example, if a commercial and a contractor is managing the building improvement, reverse charge applies. If company directly employs them, it doesn't. Yeah, if the company that owns the building directly employs them, so that's the end user, it'll fall outside the reverse charge and it become normal invoice rules. If you're employed by a contractor to work on the same building, it will fall into the reverse charge rules. Or if the contractor is owned by the business that owns the property you're working on, it falls outside the reverse charge rules and becomes normal invoicing.
That's great. Thank you, Tamara, and thank you all for joining us today. That's been a really useful presentation. Thanks, Tamara.
Thanks everyone for your time.